Hello, my name is Christian, and this is my D&D channel where I just give commentary on different D&D subjects and try to help players improve their game and make it more fun and more feasible for them and their players. So in my last video, I kind of said in a post edit that I really wasn't happy with it and I was going to go back and touch up on it later, and I definitely intend on fulfilling that promise. However, it's going to have to wait. I think that that subject needs due time and due diligence, and I'm just not there yet. And so I want to take a step back, look at what I need to do, and prepare it properly so I can execute it better. I wanted to touch on something different today. I was actually playing Assassin's Creed, which is one of my favorite game series of all times, and I was playing Odyssey, which is my favorite of all of them. So one of the reasons I really love that game is it's not like it exists in a vacuum. They do a very good job of just bringing forth just the richness and the history of Greece. Because Greece was not just around in the Peloponnesian War. Before that, they had the Dark Ages, and before that was the Mycenaean Greek. And then there's also the Minoan civilization, which folded into Greece. And it just kind of got my wheels turning about precursors, because how many times have you walked into a dungeon and not had a clue what its purpose was, why it was there? It was just a dungeon. It's just a ruin that exists in the world. I don't like that. I feel like if we're going to create rich and deep and meaningful games, we need to understand that the world does not exist in a vacuum. Our worlds have history and there's a story, and so these ruins should too. But let's go ahead and let's jump into it. In my mind, I kind of divvied this up into different sections, and so I'm just going to lay those out before you so you know what they are. First, you need to create the rise and the fall of the culture. Then you kind of need to assemble what the culture was like in a more broad sense. We'll get into why later. The third is the legacy of the culture, or how its culture persists. And then fourthly, we do want to discuss how to implement that culture into our games. So let's talk about creating the culture. So cultures, more often than not, don't go out with a bang, although that is somewhat likely in D&D because of magic and the arcane. It's kind of cliche, but maybe there's a greedy wizard who's doing some experimental energy harnessing. Phrase it however you want, but that's obviously bad and it ends in disaster and destruction of a whole city. Or maybe also the city could sink, and now you have an Atlantean city underground, disconnected from the rest of reality, which would be totally awesome, and a preserved precursor society at that. More often than not, though, they just kind of meld back into culture as a whole. They join other civilizations because of their obscurity, and so that's kind of that. And we're just left with the ruins. That's kind of what happened with the Minoans. The Minoans didn't really go away. They just rebuilt themselves into Greek culture. They joined the Mycenaean Greeks, which is post-Minoan era, and then they also fell with them, ironically. We also do want to think, what is the broad world like at that time? Did gods walk the earth? Maybe the earth is somehow underwater. There's different things you can attribute to that to just kind of make the world unique and ever-changing, because no one wants a static world. They want to see progress. They want to see change. They want to see this world come alive. And I think it's very important to address that and think about that when you're creating these histories. In addition, we do also want to address, what is their locations like? We're not here to design every single city, but we want to kind of address the scope of where they live, what their buildings are like, because we want to create some sort of consistency for the players so they know that when they walk up and there's a facade built into a cliff, they're like, oh, this is that civilization, because they always build their cities into cliffs. Just something for the players to grasp onto and connect with the world in a real and meaningful way. Lastly, but what I most think is more important, is the legacy. What technologies do they bring to the table that's still around? For example, automatrons. I think that's a very common one. Maybe there's artifacts that they brought. Maybe it's a language that they introduced. Maybe these are the original Celestials or original demonics. Probably not as likely, but you can homebrew that in your world if you want. Also, do these people still exist? Very likely they were just folded back into civilization, kind of like what I said earlier. But they could also be enclave-esque, so they just have a migrant group or a semi-nomadic group, or they have minor cities that are apart from the ruins. And so these are continuations of the people without actually being the people. Lastly, just talking about legacy, how well is this information known to other people in different demographics? Of course, if it is known, the educated are going to know the most. And then the middle class, maybe some. The poor, less likely, unless they're near one of these ruins, probably don't know much about it. They just know of it and maybe have explored it as kids or something of that nature. Lastly, before we dive into thinking about creating specific encounters or specific locations, just also consider that about 500, 600 years after the Roman Empire dissolved, the British or the feudal society within Britain was still using Roman baths. People were still using the fortified walls the Romans created. People were still and are still using aqueducts designed by the Romans. So a lot of times this stuff's kind of repurposed and retooled for society and future society. So it doesn't necessarily lose its usefulness just because that civilization no longer exists. So when we go to design a particular location, we want to consider how known it is. Is this a completely secret place? Is it partially secret? Do they maybe have a key that they don't know about? And they're like, oh, this random star-shaped object fits in this star-shaped hole in the ruins. Oh my gosh, there's a whole nother side of this ruins that no one's ever seen before. So think about whether these temples, cities, schools, arcane workshops, mines, whatever is known to the outside world. And also, if it is, let's talk about inhabitants. Because just because it's a ruin doesn't mean it's uninhabited. In fact, there is one ruin I visited in Rome that was super cool because it was inhabited by cats. Tons and tons of cats. A lot less likely it's going to be occupied by cats, but maybe it's occupied by bandits. Maybe it's occupied by a hermit. Maybe it's occupied by a dragon, of course, because if some society hoarded a lot of gold and the dragon came and conquered it, it's also kind of ruins now, and it's also kind of the dragon's hoard. I think very important, though, is what kind of artifacts did they leave behind and what can you nest in there? What also information can you nest in there? And I think this is the most important because this is what really makes the world tick is when they start to understand the world a little bit. You pull back the veil just slightly, just enough. You just give them a little peek of that history, and as they progress through the game, they start to understand the world better. And that's really what it's about. It's about adding something for your players to interact with, something for them to understand a little better, and just make the game more rich and deeper. So that's really all I had. I actually re-recorded this. The pre-edited version before this version was actually 45 minutes, and I spent like 15 minutes talking about Minoan and Mycenaean culture, and it was just pointless. I don't know why I included it, so I just sat down after editing for about 2 hours to record this, and hopefully it is better. I do feel like it is. Thank you for watching. If you made it here, it's obvious you like this, so show you like this by liking that like button down there, and also subscribe. I do plan on coming out with a video probably every week. We'll kind of see how this plays out. So I got stuff in the works already. I've got a few ideas. We'll see what comes out next week. I'm not even sure. But thank you so much for making it to the end. I definitely appreciate it. The algorithm has helped in my favor, and I'm just trying to give a little bit of a voice and some ideas to help other DMs create awesome worlds for their players to play in. Have a great rest of the day.